Yeah. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. Great to have such a nice turnout. Why wouldn't there be when we have such a wonderful person in town today? My name is Matt Makeley. I'm a faculty member in the history department. I'm also the president of the faculty senate here at Metro State. The reason I'm here is because I'm really good friends with Adam. This will be our 10th year working together. And what I've learned about Adam is there's never a dull moment when you're with him. So Adam has put together an organization on campus many of you are probably familiar with. It's called the Denver Project for Humanistic Inquiry, DeFi for short. In that capacity, DeFi has been doing wonderful things around the city, on campus, trying to bring together the larger community around topics that are inviting and at times controversial or difficult, but nevertheless stimulating. In pursuit of that, Adam managed to have a conversation with Noam Chomsky last year. He brought a Pulitzer Prize winning poet to campus, Paul Muldoon, last spring, I think that was, and that was a really lovely opportunity. So DeFi is an organization that if you are not familiar with, I hope you will become familiar with them. They have a Facebook page, they have a website, and they will be announcing upcoming events. But today we're extremely pleased to have Mr. Frank in town. And with that, I will hand it over to Adam.
Thank you, Matt. Really appreciate it. I can't take credit for any of this. I want to really quickly thank my work study students, Gabriel and Peter, the philosophy department, the history department, political science department. A number of departments have really been supportive of our effort to make DeFi successful. And last but certainly not least, the College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences. Thank you, Dean Foster, for being here today. I'm going to quickly introduce our speaker, who hardly needs an introduction. But bear with me as I read something quickly. Barney Frank represented the 4th Congressional District of Massachusetts for more than 3 decades. He chaired the House Financial Services Committee from 2007 to 2011, during which time he co-authored the 2010 Dodd-Frank Act, arguably the most significant piece of financial regulation legislation passed since the Great Depression. The first openly gay member of Congress, Frank is widely considered the most prominent gay politician in the United States, but I think it's safe to say that he's also one of the most prominent and influential politicians, full stop. In my estimation, and in the estimation of many others, he's easily among the most intelligent, articulate, and witty members of Congress in modern American history. Though now retired, he remains actively involved in political life. He's a regular commentator on a variety of national news programs where he can be seen eviscerating his political adversaries with really a tongue that is sharp, so sharp it's really unparalleled. I'm not going to be picking any fights today for fear of what might happen to me in such a public setting. Though Coloradans might be interested in knowing that as a state legislator back in 1972, he filed the first gay rights bill and the first marijuana legalization bill. He's been a tireless advocate for the causes of social and economic justice, and we are incredibly honored to have him with us today. I just want to add one last thing, and that is that he's here really out of his own generosity. He's obviously an incredibly important figure who's in incredibly high demand at this particular moment in time, since we're in the middle of an election cycle, and he offered to do this just for the sake of having conversations with our campus community and students in particular. So please, warm welcome to now do we have a second microphone that's functioning? Not yet. We're working on it. Okay, that's fine. I'm going to pass this mic.
It'll be like Lord of the Flies.
It'll be Lord of the Flies. Pass it back.
It's too old a book for anybody in
Well, we'll certainly pass it back in forth until we have that second microphone. But let me just give you a quick rundown on how I envision this working. First, I'm going to basically have a conversation with Representative Frank about some of the issues that students have raised with me in talking to students about this event. After that time, I'm going to call up some students from some courses, students that have submitted questions in advance. By the way, I should tell you that I haven't shared any of these questions with Representative Frank yet. I think he likes surprises, so we've kept this a surprise. And then after that, finally, we will open it up to the floor for Q&A. I will make a quick request, though. Make sure, A, that your question is a question. It's remarkable how infrequently that happens at political events. So make sure that your question is a question. And B, try to state your question as succinctly as possible so that we can make sure that as many students as possible have a chance to ask questions. So with that, let me pass the baton. And I thought we could begin just by talking a little bit about what inspired you initially to enter public service.
Yes, and I want to say, first of all, that I admire the work you're doing in this operation, so I'm happy to be here. As you know, I was able to coattail because I will be doing a very interesting event tonight for Congresswoman Diana DeGette, who after years of being invited before she was in office to events called Women for This One and Women for That One, is having her, I think, 10th annual Men for DeGette event tonight. So I'm one of the men for DeGette. It's also fortuitous. I didn't realize that I was going to be here the day before National Coming Out Day. I did my own coming out in 1987, and I just, you know, I had to be scrupulous. And I understand because Wikipedia and others get it wrong, and I appreciate your generosity. I'm not the first openly gay member of Congress. I am the first one to volunteer that I was gay. My colleague Gary Stutz, who sadly died early, was involved in a situation, and he did acknowledge being gay. He was not the first gay member of Congress to be involved in something untoward, and I should say I later was after I came out. But he was the first to acknowledge being gay. The previous 8 or 10 gay members of Congress who have been caught doing things that they wish they hadn't been caught doing, kind of, you might say that they were way too young, although none of them were 59 to my knowledge. I don't think most of them have been in a locker room, but in any case, their explanation was in every case, I think about 5 of them, that they were all too drunk to remember. And it's been my own experience that when people are too drunk to remember, they weren't able to do anything that was worth remembering. But I was the first to do it voluntarily. Secondly, and I appreciate, because they came out and I was chairman of the committee and I have the legislation, that I was, for a while, the most prominent openly gay politician, but I would like to acknowledge now that we are within a few miles of the current senior, very able openly gay politician in America, Jared Polis, who does a wonderful job for it. I was just interested in politics. I don't know why. You know, people say, well, why this, why that? I don't know. Look, I was a kid, and I liked sports, but I knew that, you know, I had some skills, but not others. I was never going to be a professional athlete. I learned early on that I talk good. I can't sing. I have been in a lifelong war with inanimate objects. I get frustrated and break things when I'm trying to open them and turn them on. I've had three relationships in my life that by far the most profound, thankfully, is the current one. And there were 3 very different men, but I can hear all of them in my head saying, Barney, don't touch it. The result is broken, or the screws, or whatever. But I was always good at talking in class. And I also just found myself in politics. And what happened was, in 1940, which was the year I was born, you will all be surprised to know that my father bought a television set. It was one of the first television sets in America. He was what we now call an early adopter. And in 1950, I was 10 years old, I watched the hearings conducted by a senator named Estes Kefauver into the Mafia. organized crime. You will have seen something inspired by that if you've seen The Godfather, and you see the Senate hearing where the guy who's supposed to testify then is intimidated not to by his relative and doesn't. But it was a fascinating thing. I didn't fully understand it, but I thought, now here's this is fascinating. You're these guys, and they're up there, and they're asking people questions. They were doing something I was good at. It looked interesting. It was a good way for a kid to get into politics because it was partly cops and robbers and partly political. And from then on, I was just interested. And as I get older, I realized politics is something I would like to do. The problem was that I knew I was gay. I realized that when I was 13. Apparently, I don't remember, this is 63 years ago, I don't want to doubt an eminent brain surgeon. Apparently, according to Ben Carson, I decided at 13 to be gay. I don't remember. I do not remember deciding it, but apparently I did. But I did know that it did not make a political career very likely, because to be in politics you had to be popular, because Doug was popular. To be gay was to be as despised as anything on earth. In 1953 and 54, there was just no possibility that you were going to ever have any decent relationship with any other human being. And what then happens, of course, is, I'm just over my life, and that's what I wrote about in my book. I started out believing that I would never get involved in politics because I could never run for office because being gay made me too unpopular, and to be in government, you had to be popular because government was popular. And as I got older and older, being gay became less and less unpopular, and being in government became less and less popular. And at some point in the 90s, they crossed. And in 2012, the year I retired from Congress, this is literally the case, Jim and I got married that year because we wanted to make sure that we were married when we were in Congress, so some of my anti-marriage colleagues had to associate with a same-sex married couple. And it was also just after we had passed the financial reform bill. And this is literally the case. People told me that polling showed that my marrying Jim was more popular than passing the financial reform bill. We had finished that effort. But I also, what got me into it was, one, I would be good at it too. This is what I want to do. I want to make the world better. I got down one thing that was the catalyst. When I was 14 in 1954, I saw the Army McCarthy hearings, which were a fascinating effort to challenge a terrible demagogue, Joe McCarthy. But that was also the year that a 14-year-old, I was 14, named Emmett Till was murdered in Mississippi. Emmett Till was an African-American guy from Chicago who was visiting relatives in Mississippi and looked at a white woman murdered and was brutally murdered, savage and then beaten and drowned. And to my horror, not only did I read that that had happened, but that law enforcement in Mississippi wasn't going to do anything about it, and the federal government couldn't step in because there had been the use by Southerners of the filibuster to block it. So I just said, hey, this is something I would like to do. I'd like to change things. I knew I could be good at it, but I also knew that I would be doing it in a, not as a direct elected official, but as an appointed official working for other people.
So the gay Jewish politician is a member of a persecuted class, namely he's a member of Congress. Let me pick up on that anti-government sentiment piece that you'd referred to. Today, I think there is increasingly a kind of anti-establishment sentiment, especially perhaps among the students that I teach, millennials. I know that you have criticized people on your end of the political spectrum, liberals, for government bashing, who run the risk of depriving people of the opportunity of thinking that the government can indeed accomplish something, and therefore perhaps entering into a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy type of loop. Can you talk a little bit about that anti-establishment sentiment and whether or not there's anything positive in it? Does the anti-establishment sentiment have to be anti-government?
No, it shouldn't be, although it depends on how you define establishment. To the extent that it includes anybody who has ever held any position of responsibility, it's a terrible idea because it does not differentiate. What happens, I think, is essentially it was economic. What you have is, especially in America where it started, but it's now spreading, the increase in economic activity overall is good for the country as a whole. But there's really no such thing as the country as a whole. It consists of individuals. And the nature of economic development, first in America, but increasingly in the developed world, is to benefit some people much more than others. And in the 60s, if you were a white guy, because there were prejudices based on sex and race, but if you were a white guy and you graduated from high school and you were willing to work, you made a good living because you could go to a steel factory, an auto factory, a glass factory, etc. And increasingly, and that was partly because after World War II, America made everything, because we were the only economy that survived World War II in good shape. Increasingly, the rest of the world began to catch up with us. First it was Europe, so they got stuff, and Japan. I mean, you know, 40 years ago, people would have been complaining about the Japanese making all these things that were so cheap, etc. And then the rest of Europe got the same situation. So you have a situation now where the natural workings of the economy, of the market economy, and Thomas Piketty in his book talks about this, it increases the overall wealth of a country, but exacerbates inequality. And the problem is that politically, the view became dominant in America that all you had to do was to increase the overall wealth and not worry about the distribution. And that made things worse off for people. And in fact, and you see this now, if you find your own economic position eroding, being told that the country as a whole is doing well, not only doesn't alleviate your anger, it makes you madder. Oh, everybody's doing good but me, or, you know, where's my share? And so I think that led into this anti-government view. There were some other factors. There was the war in Vietnam, Richard Nixon and Watergate. And so government, and here you can see what had happened. In 1960, John Kennedy is elected president. His inaugural address, his signature line was, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. That's a very pro-government statement. How can you contribute to the collective good, and what can you do to enhance that? Exactly 20 years later, Ronald Reagan is elected, and his signature line is, government is not the answer to our problems. Government is the problem. It's within that 20 years. Now, America's economic advantage begins to erode. You also have, in the early 70s, a major factor, the oil-producing countries decide they're going to start charging a lot more for their oil, having a major impact on our economic situation. OPEC is founded in the early 70s. And so, what you then get, beginning with Reagan, is a vicious cycle. Now, a couple of problems, I should mention one other. White working class men are now no longer in the position they were in the 60s, where they could just go to work and have a good job. It is largely the way the economy is working. A, the fact that the rest of the world is catching up to us. B, technology. What then happens, and those go together, because increasingly what America can sell to the rest of the world and to ourselves is high-end stuff. We need a lot of skill and a lot of education. The low-end stuff in terms of skills, not in work required, and energy and effort, that goes elsewhere. I represented for 30 years an area in Massachusetts which used to be the head of the garment textile industry, Fall River and New Bedford, Massachusetts. That went away, although not entirely. I'm wearing a union-made suit, by the way. If you want to buy a suit, which probably some of you don't see any need to for some time, but if and when you decide you need a suit, if you go to the Joseph Abboud section, you can buy a union-made suit manufactured in America, in New Bedford, by a union. But what happens is people are, well, how come I'm not doing as well as my father? Why can't I get a good job? And unfortunately, some people decided it was the fault of other people, of women, of black people, of immigrants. So, and Ronald Reagan stoke that. Ronald Reagan was a very amiable bigot. And so what you get then is an increasing view that the reason people aren't doing well is not that the government, it's not the natural work of the economy, it's that the government is actively making it worse by favoring these other people. And then you get a vicious cycle, the self-fulfilling prophecy you talk about. People get mad at government, so they vote for people who also are mad at government. And the more people are in power who are mad at government, the worse government becomes because it can't do anything. So those things that government could have been doing to alleviate this economic inequality, and can still do now, fortunately, because I think we'll get a chance next year, they don't do. And so people get madder and madder at government, they elect people who are madder and madder at government. Then one other thing enters into it, and that is the media. And it becomes increasingly fashionable, and I think this is the problem you asked about younger people, where it is now fashionable to just government bash and not to make distinctions. There are a couple, I'm a great believer in free speech. I let anybody say anything. But, I mean, literally, I don't believe that the notion of hate speech is people want to say hateful things, that's called free speech. You know, I did want to say to you, if you're not a true defender of free speech unless you are prepared to defend the right of some terrible person to say vicious things. You know, nobody needs to defend you for saying nice things. But there are a couple of things I would like to ban. One, on the side, is the use of metaphors in the discussion of public policy. That's a separate issue. Please do not say when you talk about American politics today, oh, a plague on both their houses. People are not equally guilty. I will go into this. And so what troubles me when you have in the media this bashing of everybody, and that included, by the way, Jon Stewart. Jon Stewart was very funny and very clever and very destructive, I thought, because if you watch the Jon Stewart show, nobody in public office ever did anything right. They were all either stupid or corrupt or whatever. Now, it's possible to be accurate in every specific thing you say while conveying an overall inaccurate picture by the selection. So nothing good ever happened on the Jon Stewart show with regard to the public. And then the internet added that. As people less and less read newspapers, and I'm 76, and I'm in good health in general, but I am troubled because it now looks to me like I am going to outlive two things on which I have relied for much of my life: newspapers and my spine. And I don't know how I'm going to quite get along without either of them, certainly not both. But as people less and less read newspapers and more rely on the internet for their information, that gets exacerbated. Probably what happens is, with regard to the internet, people only hear what they want to hear. Modern communications today, the internet and other issues like that, people live in two parallel universes. They mostly hear what they want to hear. But beyond that, it's even the non-news things, YouTube, etc. I do not myself turn into social media much. I'm not sure this, but people tell me who follow more closely than I am. No clip of a United States Senator telling a cabinet secretary that she did a good job has ever gone viral in the history of the internet. What goes viral is, you stupid so-and-so, why did you, people yell. I have found people, frankly, and my husband has noted this, he said, oh, you know, we go to a dinner party, well, they were kind of surprised that you didn't yell at anybody. Well, that's because when they saw me on television, I was yelling, because television doesn't have not through the internet. They don't show clips of you being nice to someone or being complimentary. So I think that all exacerbated this whole thing. That's why my favorite political comedian is Bill Maher, because he's not only very funny, but he knows, you know, he differentiates. So, you know, this plague on both your houses is a terrible idea. In case you're interested, the other phrase people should not use these days, I believe, is, oh, he's so extreme, he's more Catholic than the Pope, because today a significant number of the bishops are more Catholic than the Pope, so that one has kind of lost its force.
Well, let me ask a question about our system of democracy. Having spent now decades working in Washington, Knowing what you know, had you been at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, would you have insisted on any changes or tweaks?
Yes. The 2 senators per state is a terrible distortion of democracy. And by the way, for people who hate political deals, you know, that was just a plain compromise. You had big states and little states. And how do you deal with the little states' fear that they'll be outvoted and the big states' fear that they won't have their full vote? So you get a bicameral legislature. The bicameral legislature, 2 fully equal legislative houses, is an American peculiarity and is a great cause of frustration and gridlock. I understand why people wouldn't want a single chamber the way they have in most places, but having the 2 senators per state does not make any sense. I would have gotten rid of that. That's the major structural issue. Now what happened is, people politically grafted onto that the filibuster, which says that you need 60 votes, it used to be 67, to get a bill passed in the Senate. That is totally outside the Constitution. In fact, if you read the Constitution, it strongly suggests that only a majority should be needed. And the reason I say that is, there are several places in the Constitution where it says that 2/3 is needed. Well, the rule of legal construction is where it says 2/3 is needed for this or that specific, that means it's a majority everywhere else. You know, if the sign says no parking Mondays 8 to 10, that means you park every other time. That's the phrase that people misuse. It's called the exception proves the rule. What it says is the statement of an exception establishes that there is a rule. So that's the one change I would have made.
What do you think accounts for the durability of the 2-party system? Now, barring, say, the specific circumstance we find ourselves in today, so obviously if you extract from the current election cycle, what accounts for that? And do you think it's healthy?
I haven't thought about whether it's healthy because I don't see any possibility of changing it. I mean, I don't worry about things I couldn't change. I do think if you have too much fracturing, it's not a good idea. There are 2 arguments about the 2-party system. One is political scientists believe that a 2-party system is fostered in part by what is called the first past the post election system. That says that where people are elected to represent specific districts, whoever gets more votes than anybody else wins without having to get a majority. But even in cases where that's not true, you still tend to have a 2-party system. France has a runoff system. You still tend to get a 2-party system. I think it is this. I think in most democratic, modified capitalist societies, there are 2 fundamental tendencies. Now, we've gone a little bit off now, I believe, because of the Republicans, frankly, moving outside of this consensus. But here's the situation in capitalist democracies. You have 2 elements, a private sector and a public sector. And rational people understand you need them both. You need the private sector to create wealth, to create the goods and services. You need the public sector, A, to take care of the people who aren't going to make it in the private sector. B, to have rules so the private sector does things fairly. One of the problems we had in leading up to the financial crisis was we would talk to some people in banks and we'd say, why did you do that? That was a very irresponsible thing to do. And the answer was, well, if we didn't do it, they'd do it. And if they did it and we didn't do it, we'd be at a disadvantage. The head of Citicorp, when asked about it, why were you doing this? He said, well, when the music's playing, you got to dance with everybody else. And the third thing is, you need to prevent the private sector from doing those things that are in the interest of the particular entity, but are damaging to society as a whole, what economists call externalities. That's clearly the case with the environment. Now, there are 2 general tendencies. Rational people know you need both, and you need the interaction. And public policy is essentially where you set the point of interaction. There is a tendency that generally favors the private sector more and wants to minimize the public sector, but not get rid of it. And there is a tendency that wants to increase the public sector's intervention and minimize, but not get rid of, the market aspects. Now, by the way, that has been the balance in America for certainly the 20th century. Unfortunately, I believe our current disarrangement is that in response and in anger at the financial crisis of 2008, and then what had to be done to deal with it, the Republican Party moved outside that consensus. So the Republican Party today consists of people who do not value the public sector. That is not George W. Bush. It's certainly not George H.W. Bush. It's not Ronald Reagan. But you do have people in the Republican Party today. What happened was, this begins in 2010. What starts in 2007 and 8. When George W. Bush comes to Congress and says, you know what, I'm a conservative and I'm for free enterprise, but if we don't do some unusual interventions to deal with this banking crisis, we're going to have even worse troubles than we have. And by the way, you want to know what happened to bipartisanship? We Democrats said, okay, we'll help you out. And we were in charge, we were in the majority. And if you read the books by the Reagan, the Bush people, the W people, Ben Bernanke, head of the Federal Reserve, Sheila Bair, who was head of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, Henry Paulson, Secretary of the Treasury, recommend their books to you. They talk about how the Democrats gave them more help some than the Republicans. The Republicans were angry, many of them, because what George W. Bush was asking went further into the public sector intervention than they wanted to see. And then Barack Obama takes over, and they then decide, okay, the Democrats want to run the government, they can run the government, hell with them. And so they go into opposition, and they go into a form of opposition that I believe breaks this notion that we go back and forth. And what happens if you go back to 2010, you want to write about this? Go study the Republican primaries of 2010, when Republican conservatives, I'm not talking about liberal Republicans, when Republican conservatives who had voted with George W. Bush in terms of dealing with the crisis of 2008 got defeated. You may wonder, if you watched the debates, how someone like Rick Perry got to be the governor of Texas, a man who couldn't remember the 3 things he was going to abolish. Rick Perry was not going to win the governorship of Texas. He was running against a very impressive woman named Kate Bailey Hutchinson, who was a senator. As a Republican senator, she had voted along with George W. Bush for what he thought was needed to stabilize the economy. She got defeated. Rick Perry called her Kate Bailout Hutchinson. Republicans lost in 2010. So what happens, the Republican Party moved into this extreme opposition position, and that's exacerbated because they made things worse and worse. They made the government even less functional. And as the government becomes less functional, people get angrier. That's the vicious cycle. And I'll just to anticipate, well, what do you do about it? We reached the point where, and now, by the way, and it goes back to many in the establishment, there is now a widespread recognition on people, and some of us were arguing for this. Let me just at this point, people tell lies, as you know, fibs. One fib you'll hear from people in the business I used to be in is, oh, I love to campaign. Boy, it sucks. I mean, anybody who tells you she likes campaigning is really, there's something the matter with her if she's telling you the truth. Because it's a boring, terrible, frustrating, pressure, it's everything bad. But you have a situation where in the campaign, somehow things get worse. And there is an element sometimes in campaigns for people to bring out the worst in each other. But there's another fib that people tell. I don't like to say, I told you so. Everybody I know likes to say, I told you so. I will tell you, what only a few other people in this audience know, it gets better with age. You can say, I told you so, no matter how old you are, and you don't have to take a pill before, during, or after you do it. You can just do it. And many of us told people, look, you're making a mistake, you're angering people. If you don't do a better job of sharing the wealth, if you continue to let the economy grow in a way that also increases inequality, it's going to blow. Well, it's blown this year. One example, for years when many of us talked about fairness, raising taxes on the rich, raising the minimum wage, supporting labor unions, doing more for working people, we were told, you're engaging in class warfare. Don't worry about that. Just help us grow. Don't worry about this. That argument used to be very potent. It died this year. Nobody is talking about it anymore. We are now at the point where the only thing that's going to work is if people get in control of the government here, England, Germany, France, other places, and show how government can be used to decrease inequality. We're beyond talking people out of it. You have to demonstrate the reality.
So I'm going to ask one more question, but as I do that, maybe I could have the students from Liz Goodnick's class come over here and queue up, as it were, if any of you are here. Oh, you are already in the front. Okay, then don't worry about it. So just prepare yourself. Yeah, just the people who are asking questions, exactly. So let me ask, I think the distinction between church, the division between church and state in America is made more sharply, constitutionally speaking, than in many other democracies, in Europe, for example. And yet, religious language has played a significant role in political discourse for a long time, but perhaps even increasingly so throughout the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s. I know that you describe yourself as a non-theist. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about the appropriateness of religious language and religious-based arguments in political discourse in general.
Yeah, I am myself agnostic. I think it is important for us to maintain a very fundamental distinction, namely that people should be entirely free to practice their own religion, but not impose on other people. Now, that doesn't mean, oh, you don't impose your religious morality. I mean, you know, thou shalt not kill or steal. Those are both religious and secular principles. But those things that are particularly religious, those that have to do with ceremonial observance in particular, those that regulate your own behavior that have no effect on anybody else's behavior, I guess that's the best distinction I would make. Where we are talking about religious tenets that primarily affect your behavior and no one else's, then there should be no imposition of that by believers on non-believers. Yes, if you were talking about regulating people's behavior towards each other, that's entirely legitimate. Some of your motives might be religious. But you have no right, it would seem to me, it's a bad society when I am forced to follow other people's religious tenets when they affect primarily me. You know, some things get overcomplicated. John Stuart Mill, 19th century philosopher, great principle, where you are primarily affected by your actions, it's up to you. When you affect somebody else, it's up to, then they can intervene. That, not Mill himself, who was much too elegant for this, but somebody summarized that as, your right to swing your fist stops just short of my nose. Now, I think the problem in America is that too many religious people have disregarded that and seek to impose their purely ceremonial, may sound like I'm trivializing it, their tenets of their religion, their theological beliefs on other people, and that's where I think it should stop.
Thank you. So let's see now. Who do we have first? James? Is James here? Yeah. Oh, come on up, James. I'm going to hand you the microphone.
So, an analysis by Princeton scholars Martin Gillens and Benjamin Page demonstrated that, and I'm quoting, when the preferences of economic elites and the stands of organized interest groups are controlled for, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact on public policy. The same study found that the two demographics for which opinion proves predictive of public policy were the preferences of economic elites and business interest groups. I have two related questions given the state of American politics. Number one, what are your thoughts about campaign finance reform, public financing of elections, or an amendment to overturn Supreme Court rulings like Citizens United versus the FEC, McCutcheon versus the FEC, or Buckley versus Valeo? And number two, what pragmatic options exist, if any, to progress towards American democracy that is representative of its population, and what can individuals do to contribute to genuine progress in this issue?
I'll start with the very clear-cut ones. I am in favor of overturning this set of Supreme Court decisions that very recently and very radically say you can't regulate campaign spending. By the way, the constitutional amendment would never pass. To pass the Constitution was made very hard to amend. To amend the Constitution, you need 2/3 of both houses of Congress and 3/4 of the states. Not only that, you have to, and this is the problem when you're reforming a political system, you need to have a substantial number of people who are benefiting from the existing system decide to change it. There's one way and one easy way to reverse those decisions, and that is to elect Hillary Clinton president so she can appoint a Supreme Court justice. The Supreme Court is now tied 4-4 on that issue. If Hillary Clinton is appointed, no question that the Supreme Court justice she will appoint will be for overturning it. In addition, one of the other four is Justice Kennedy, who's 80 or 81. So that's the only way to change it. I am very much for it. It's one of the reasons why I look forward to Hillary Clinton's election. You will turn that around. And the decisions that said you can't regulate fund spending is ridiculous. By the way it works, when the Supreme Court has invalidated a law, if you get it reversed, you can't just reverse it in America. There has to be a case that reverses it. What will have to happen, but it will, a state will then pass a law that would violate those decisions, and the new Supreme Court majority would uphold it, and you could go from there. As to the dominance of the elite, I believe that needs to be updated. They say that it is the economic elite and the business interests. They did not allow for Donald Trump. I guarantee you that even within the Republican Party, Donald Trump is not the candidate of the business elite. He is the candidate of the voters who vote in Republican primaries, the Tea Party people and others. There is a strong anti-immigrant sentiment in America today that the business and elite people don't agree with. So I think I don't think they've had enough contact to the public. But in any case, it's academic, because the way to correct it is for more people to vote more intelligently. People have said, well, how do we wind up with two unpopular candidates, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton? Well, how do we wind up with them? Anybody know? They won the primary. Each one of them got more votes in the primary from the people who chose to vote than anybody else. Now, there are people who don't like them, but they didn't vote. And what complaint have they got if they didn't vote? Again, Trump and Clinton won the primaries. And let me just tell you, in Clinton's case, she particularly won the primaries. Bernie Sanders was the nominee of the caucuses, like here in Colorado. 14% of the Democrats in Colorado showed up to nominate him. Well, I don't want to hear the other 86% who sat home that they don't like what happened, or vice versa. I mean, people will come up to me sometimes when I'm still in office, well, I don't like, I'm very upset with Congress. I said, well, who's your congressman? Oh, I don't know. I said, well, how is that my fault? Why the hell don't you know? Why don't you do something about it? So people can vote more intelligently. And I think that's part of it. People, and people who get their news from TV comedy shows and YouTube, no, they're not going to have much effect. I disagree that the vote, I will tell you that politicians want very much to know what the voters think. And the problem is more that the voters don't tell them. I have to say, the best thing we can have, if more people voted more intelligently, that's the way they could break this off.
I actually, so I lied. I'm going to ask a quick follow-up. Because DeFi is a organization that believes in a well-rounded education, one that involves the humanistic disciplines, and doesn't exclude anything. Obviously, a lot of the discourse about education these days focuses on STEM. It really emphasizes STEM or STEAM occasionally. But many of the humanistic disciplines and the social science disciplines seem to be the fields of study that inculcate kind of critical thinking skills and perhaps focus more on civic engagement than doing work in a laboratory, for example, or learning how to perform certain specific industry-related skills. I wonder if you could comment on perhaps the role, how you envision the role of the humanities and a more liberal arts education in the current political climate that seems to increasingly emphasize industry-related training over that.
Well, I don't see that, to be honest. I don't see the reason for that is, I don't think it's gotten any worse over the past 50 years. I mean, I think that part of the problem, and we're talking about, I don't think you need to have had a particularly deep education in literature or philosophy to know how to vote and who you want to vote for.
We can edit this part out of the video.
I think the value of those is it makes you, they enrich you. And look, I do think you need to make, and maybe this is part of it, you probably need to train people more than you used to for a lot of good jobs. I mean, that's part of the problem. The nature of work has gotten more technical, so you want to do that. But I want to go back. I mean, why? I don't know why people don't vote smarter. They are too easily influenced. You say, well, they don't. I guess let's deconstruct the study you talked about. Apparently, it is that people go to the polls and they vote for people who are going to do what the economic elites and the business community want, and not what they want. Well, I don't know how you get them. They need to pay more attention. Now, it is true, there is an excess of campaign money that is out there, but two of the successful candidates this year who had a lot of public support, Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, basically were not enabled by Citizens United because they didn't get, to a great extent, that kind of money. I do think the public broke through. Now, in America, and now it is in other countries, part of the issue is in America that we have had this, going back to the way we were founded and the whole notion of the frontier, etc., we have had more of an attachment to free enterprise than most other societies. I'm not sure why. I don't even know why. America is the only Western nation that's never had a socialist party, self-described socialist party of any significance. And that probably is a shorthand for what that paper showed. Namely, why do people vote against their own economic interests? Why 20 years ago was it unpopular when some of us tried to abolish the inheritance tax, which will be paid by 1% of the people? I do think this, I think it's changing. I guess I think you're going to see a change in this. People were persuaded, as I talk about it, or maybe I'm persuading myself, people were persuaded that in America, that this economic free enterprise approach was the way to go, and that to the extent that you're focused on distributive effects, you interfere with overall growth. And I think that dam's finally broken. So my guess is in a few years you would see a different result in that paper.
Allie?
Hey, Representative Frank, how are you doing? So in an interview at the Times, you said Omar Mateen, the Orlando nightclub shooter, should have been more intensely surveilled by the FBI in the period leading up to the shooting, which he had already been under some amount of surveillance. Do you believe that using state surveillance programs to monitor marginalized and so-called radical groups, which are often designated along ideological lines, is effective in the preservation of democratic ideals and protection of civil liberties in the U.S.?
No, I'm not for focusing on marginalized groups. I never have been. I think that any selection basis that involves personal characteristics, religion, or even philosophy, or certainly ethnicity, they're wrong. But I do favor surveillance. Here's the problem we have. I am in favor of law enforcement being able to listen in, monitor communications once there is some reason to do so. I will say this, I think the greater danger we have today, fairly recent, is people who commit violent crimes against others for ideological reasons, and who operate in a new atmosphere. Here's the way it works. Talk to a cop. When it comes to most crimes, traditional crimes, the cops have a very good method of operating. Much of what they do, you can see this in some of the crime shows in the Valley here. An important part of law enforcement is informants. They have people who are in the criminal world, low-level criminals, and they trade with them to get information. The problem with people who commit violent crimes because of some ideological reason is they're new, And they live in a world where the cops have no access. And the cops, the cops are blind here, where they have more insight into what's happening elsewhere. And much of what we need to do there is to allow electronic and other monitoring of what they say. Now, I understand people's concern, but I have to say this. Since 9/11, when we stepped up surveillance, and I watched this very closely, and I voted against the Patriot Act, I thought it was too broad. But I have not seen many instances, and certainly not a pattern, of surveillance being misused. I invite anybody to show me. Yes, they are listening in to some extent. Do you have any evidence that anybody was surveilled, wiretapped, monitored, and put to a disadvantage? Was anybody's private information made public in ways that it shouldn't be? Was anybody mistreated because of that? And I think the answer is no. And because I've been making a challenge and nobody showed it to me. So yeah, I do think if there is reason to suspect someone, and that's in this case, it's not random, it's not based on marginalized groups, it's not based on who goes to a mosque. But when you get any indication that somebody is sympathetic to violence, talks about it, yeah, then I believe it is in our interest to surveil that person, secure in the knowledge, by the way, that there is no evidence that he or she will be mistreated. Now, there was some concern about that right after 9/11, and there was some initial problem. But I think law enforcement's record has been pretty good here. Very good. I don't see any pattern of abuse. And if you don't let them surveil, if they cannot use surveillance, then there is no way they can protect us. I mean, how are they going to do that? Then, if they cannot use surveillance, understand that. People do not announce in public, oh, I plan to go shoot people. So if you do not have some pattern of surveillance, fine, if you think that's important for privacy, but please do not ever criticize law enforcement for failing to stop something. Or tell me how they stop it. And I think surveillance with safeguards, and I would have one other thing too. I would want to make sure, when we had a privacy board, there should be very strict rules. Anybody who is guilty of leaking any of that is severely penalized. But to my knowledge, and I've invited this, that hasn't happened. So I am for surveillance, but not on any basis of any pre-selected criteria, but only if you have a reason. Once you have reason to suspect an individual, then I'm ready to have that individual surveilled.
Mr. Frank, due to the fact that the sale of marijuana is a federal crime, and because federal laws govern the banks, currently, banks in Colorado and elsewhere have refused to accept marijuana trade cash deposits. Moreover, dispensaries have not been able to accept credit card transactions or other electronic payments from their customers. What is your view on the federal banking laws with respect to the marijuana industry?
I think that situation is outrageous. I fought against it. Jared, by the way, has been very active in that. It's probably the law, it's probably the bank's timidity and cultural sensitivity. I do not believe that any bank would be prosecuted if they did that. And I had certainly argued when I was there, we were just beginning to get there. Remember, I got to 2012 before all this went into effect. I wish some banks had the guts to do that. But they're afraid, the lawyers tell them not to. And look, the problem is this, if Donald Trump were to win, there could be a problem. Even Barack Obama, whom I greatly admire, was slow to say that the federal government would not enforce. So the best thing to do would be to pass the bill. I filed the first bill in 1972 in Massachusetts, my first year, and then Ron Paul and I filed the bills to legalize marijuana. First, to legalize in general in America, but secondly, at the very least, to move it, to make it legal in those states that wanted to make it legal. And that would be the best thing to do. Short of that, I believe that the bank regulators should make it very clear in a binding written statement to the banks that they will suffer no penalty if they accept these deposits. And I'm hoping, again, the Obama administration moved some. They haven't moved far enough. I don't understand why. But I'll make this prediction, 10 years we'll be over this. I want to make an analogy between marijuana and same-sex marriage. and I think marijuana will follow the path. In both cases, marijuana and same-sex marriage, you have an activity that some people want to engage in, that other people do not want to let them engage in because they disapprove of it. It is none of their business, it has no effect on them, it doesn't hurt them, but they morally disapprove of it. But in America, people have gotten a little bit nervous about saying, I don't want you to do that because I don't like it. It goes back to H.L. Menckens' definition of Puritanism. He was this very angry, but very funny that he got a little too pro-Nazi in the 30s. But H.L. Menckens' definition of Puritanism was the haunting fear that someone somewhere might be having a good time. And that's behind both same-sex marriage and marijuana. Now what happens is this, people don't want to just say, oh, I don't want you to do that because it's nasty. So they invent negative social impacts. They say, oh, we don't want you to do that because it will have negative impacts on the rest of us. Now that was particularly like that with same-sex marriage, and we went through it, but remember, the law that was passed in '96 to interfere with same-sex marriage, to deny same-sex couples federal benefits, was called the Defense of Marriage Act. It should have been called, we don't like one of them, so two is twice as bad Act, because that's what it was. But they had to call it the Defense of Marriage Act as if we were somehow attacking their marriage. And what then happened, and then you get a vicious cycle. Because a lot of people who aren't directly affected are persuaded that it will hurt them, you can't get it into place. And when you can't get it into place, you can't refute the notion that it will have negative social consequences. And then you get a breakthrough. In Massachusetts in 2004, a wonderful Supreme Judicial Court, as we call it, 4-3 voted to allow same-sex marriage. And I knew then we'd won the fight, because that was the beachhead. And what happened then was, as it went on, it became clearer and clearer, and a couple other states joined us, that no, there were no negative social consequences, none whatever. And that's when it spread. And that's how, even though the Supreme Court did it, we were winning the fight in most states. Marijuana is similar. There are no negative social consequences to non-smokers when people smoke marijuana. Not many to smokers. Then a couple of states go ahead, in this case, here and Washington. And then the people who have argued against it are in trouble because there are no negative consequences. So the absence of negative consequences will ultimately see, I think within 10 years, the legalization of marijuana in most of the country. It won't be by the Supreme Court, because the right to smoke marijuana is not comparable to the right to same-sex marriage, because, and the reason is this, what the Supreme Court did in the marriage case was to protect a defined class of people, a vulnerable minority. There is no pre-defined class of marijuana smokers, so it's not going to be, now, you're not going to have equal protection of the laws, gay versus straight, smokers versus non-smokers, the analogy doesn't hold. But so the answer is, people should press the administration until they get a law passed, and they should try to do that and make it legal. But until then, the banking regulators and the Attorney General should issue a statement that says nobody will be prosecuted after the next election, but they know that'll be good for 4 years.
Thank you.
And let me just say, if you have a question, you can come and maybe queue up over here, and that way we have a sense of how many questions people have to ask, if that's okay.
Congressman Frank, for all of my life there has been distrust in the politicians we elect. My father often says that this country has not been a democracy since JFK held office.
Who said that?
My father. Given the anti-establishment campaigns of Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, I can see that this distrust is not a solitary belief. What do you think causes distrust in politicians? And more importantly, do you think there is a remedy for this distrust?
Well, let me start with the remedy. Yeah, the remedy, we've got to break the vicious cycle. I believe, my hope is, and it is deeply rooted, I don't doubt it. I do have to say, would you ask your father, what was democratic about John Kennedy that wasn't about anybody else?
Do you want to defend your fathers?
Yes. I'm pretty sure he would mention the 2000 election.
Well, but there were 4 years between 1960 and the 2000 election. Why was for Jimmy Carter's election, not Democratic, or Ronald Reagan's, or even Richard Nixon's. I mean, he said since John Kennedy died in 1963, we've had elections every year since 1964, every 4 years. So I think, and by the way, people on the left were very critical of John Kennedy when he was there. I was not. I was alive during his administration. I was an adult. But the distrust, I said, I think the fundamental of the distrust, and it does start between 60 and 80, not 2000, as I cited with the two statements by Reagan and then, by the way, Bill Clinton felt he had to accommodate it, so he kind of went more on the Reagan side rhetorically, although not substantively. I think the fundamental reason for the distrust is in America first, and then in other Western democracies, the way the economy has worked has separated the overall progress in the economy from the well-being of the majority of people in it. And this is what Thomas Piketty writes about in his book. That the working of modern capitalism today, especially in a world of trade, where you have lower income countries trading with us, that there has been a substantial erosion in the relative position within these democratic capitalist societies of working class people, exacerbated by the view that others are doing better than they. White people feeling that about blacks in America, men about women, and now in Europe about immigrants, etc. In England about immigrants. European immigrants. By the way, the objection in England to immigrants was non-racial. Remember, England was pulling out of the European Union because of other Europeans. So that, I think, was the fundamental problem. Exacerbated by the media. It became fashionable to be anti-government. And the only way to break out of it, I believe, is, at this point, to have government once again begin to do things that are good for people. I believe now that the only way that's going to happen is if you have, because the Republican Party has become somewhat anti-government, that requires the Democrats to have enough control. My hope is Hillary Clinton wins the presidency, the Democrats win the Senate, and I think both of those are now the first very, very likely, the second very likely, and there's an increase in Democrats in the House. I'll tell you one of the most significant things I think you're going to see next year is a historical anomaly. Speaker of the House Paul Ryan is the first Speaker of the House since John Nance Garner in 1931 who wants to be president. A Speaker who wants to be president will act very differently than a Speaker who only has to worry about the other members of the House. And he will not want to be the obstructionist. I believe if Hillary Clinton is president and you then get past a major construction bill that begins to improve highways and rail transportation and builds good facilities so you can get solar and wind power transmitted, not just from the physical place where it is done. You raise the minimum wage and you do something about college costs and alleviate some of the loans that are out there to private people and lessen the medical burden on people. If you do those things, it work. Now, Barack Obama had 2 good years legislatively, but what we did had no immediate benefit for people. Yes, the health care bill, I believe it helps a lot of people. It didn't take effect for a while. And even then, it's uneven in who it helps. It helps the poorest people, who are the ones who generally participate least politically. I'm very proud of the financial reform bill, but the financial reform bill did not, on the whole, benefit anybody, except for the Consumer Bureau, individually. What it did was to prevent bad things from happening. Now, that's a real problem in politics. Some of the hardest work you do is not to do something positive, but to avoid a negative. That's very important. But you get no political credit for avoiding a negative. In 2010, I had some unpopularity because I was seen as active in the response to the financial crisis. We had passed a very good bill, but that was a bill that was going to stop things from being exacerbated. And I was very frustrated. I won by 11 points, but I usually won by 35 or 40. And I won. I had a bumper sticker. I actually printed up only one. I wanted to get out. And because I was frustrated, I wasn't getting any credit politically, not surprisingly, because I had kept things from getting worse. And my bumper sticker said, "Things would have sucked worse without me," which was A, true, and B, politically of no use to you. So what I hope is if Hillary Clinton is president, we will be able to do things that will show people that there's real benefit. We're beyond being able to talk anybody out of it. And once we begin to do that, then you start putting people back to work. You see their wages, but their wages are starting to go up. But if you see people going back to work and seeing the tangible benefits of it, and as I said, the minimum wage goes up, and the minimum wage goes up, the wages of people just above the minimum go up too. And you alleviate, I would like to take, I think single best thing to do, expand Medicare downward to 55. So you take people 55 to 65 and take some of the health pressures off them. And if you're a private employer and you're paying for your private insurance, if people 55 and over are taking off your rolls, they're the biggest users of healthcare. It'll be cheaper for you. But I'm hoping the Democrats can control the government and then show how it can be useful.
Hello, Representative Frank. I'm speaking to you today as a Bernie Sanders DNC delegate. And looking at the community of people who formed around Senator Sanders, there's a lot of confusion on what we should be doing as a collective unit. Some of us want to stay in the party and help Bernie. Others want to leave the party. Some even are talking about, starting new parties completely. My question for you isn't what we should do leading up to the election, but where can the Bernie people fit into our political system post-election?
What do you want to do? What's your goal?
My goal?
Your long-term goal, not your instrumental goal.
Long-term goal, I think, in my opinion, when I look at the role of government in society, I think it should be to not only protect the freedom of the people, but maximize it.
Okay. Do you want to change public policy?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think that's what everyone who gets involved in politics.
Then I think you want then, the next question is, or after that, all right, how do you maximize your influence over public policy? I do not understand how starting a new party would do that. Part of it is this: people have this misconception about parties. Parties in America are very loose coalitions. You know who the Democratic Party is in the presidential year? So people decide to vote in primaries and caucuses. There was I know there were emails that showed, the Democratic National Committee was trying to help Hillary Clinton. You know what? They're worth nothing. What is it? Did you know anybody who said, "Oh, well, wait a minute, Debbie Wasserman Schultz wants me to vote for Hillary Clinton, so I better do that"? I mean, I've been doing this for a long time. The Democratic National Committee, nice group of people, couldn't put out a fire. I mean, and it's not their fault. There's no instrumental structure there. They had no impact on who won the primaries and the caucuses. Basically what happened was, Bernie Sanders won most of the caucuses because he had the more enthusiastic people. Hillary Clinton won more of the primaries, partly because some of the major groups in the party, African Americans, Hispanics, and others, had an affiliation with her. So the question then is, going forward, how do you maximize your influence? And by the way, take a lesson from Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders had been an independent socialist in ideology, but his affiliation was independent until he decided that he wanted to have more influence. What did he do? He joined the Democratic Party. Well, Bernie was right. Do you think Bernie Sanders has had more influence inside the Democratic Party participating in the primaries, or if he'd run as a third-party candidate? He wasn't going to do that. He's not Ralph Nader. He knows better than that. So the answer is, yeah. I wish. I have for a long time wanted to make some changes. I would like to have people come in. And by the way, I think we lost a great opportunity with Occupy. We had two movements motivated by anger at the economic situation and at the established political order. The Tea Party and Occupy. I agreed much more with Occupy. Well, not entirely. There were some elements of their economic view that I thought were unrealistic. But unfortunately, from my standpoint, the Tea Party was not smarter politically. What did the Tea Party people do? They got into the Republican Party and took it over. What did the people in Occupy do? They smoked dope and had drum circles. I got to tell you, I've been in office. I was in office 40 years. Nobody that I know of, none of my colleagues ever cared about a drum circle. They didn't have any impact. And I was on the Bill Maher show. The woman who was an active member of Occupy, she wasn't a leader because they didn't have leaders. But I said, one of the things that troubled me is I never saw a voter registration table at an Occupy site. And she said, well, that's not what we were into. Well, that's too bad. So the answer is, I think you will find the Democratic Party is much more amenable to your having a great deal of influence on it than before. Look, if you could win the caucuses, why do you think you couldn't win the other offices? Now, I would say this, practical thing. Probably not worth, I would not spend a lot of time going after incumbents. One thing I gotta tell you, you have 3 Democratic House members here who are superb. Ed Perlmutter, Diana DeGette, and Jared Polis are smart and tough. But you have other seats. They will leave. You have seats in the legislature. Make a list. If I were you in the Sanders people, what I would do now, sorry, let's have our caucus. Let's have a Sanders convention. Let's draw up a list of every legislative seat in Colorado that's going to be coming vacant in the next couple of years. And let's pick those areas where we have a lot of strength. And let's go nominate our candidates. Let's do it that way. And I think you will find people not at all resistant and glad to have it. So yeah, I think overwhelmingly that's clearly the thing to do.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we're going to have time for just one more quick question, I'm afraid. I apologize. But I know students are going to have to run off to the next classes quite soon.
Thank you for being here. I have a question about the Dodd-Frank Act. With regard to the Dodd-Frank Act, what provisions were added from when the bill was first proposed to when it was finally passed? And were there any provisions that didn't make it onto the final bill that you yourself would have personally liked to see make it on there?
Good question. The one that we added, and I'm very proud of, that it was not in the original conception in 2008, and she writes about it in the book, was the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which we added in consultation with Elizabeth Warren. I'm very proud of that, and it's done a lot of great work. The biggest thing that was added is what's known as the Volcker Rule. The Volcker Rule was sponsored by Paul Volcker, who was the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, first under Jimmy Carter and then into Ronald Reagan. And he is a longtime leader of the finance community who's been very skeptical of a lot of the new financial devices. He thinks they've done more harm than good. In fact, he said, we're talking about derivatives now, and credit default swaps, and collateralized debt obligations, etc. And Paul said that he thinks the last really useful economic innovation was the ATM. But he came up with the proposal that the banks hated to say that no bank, that is a bank that's got deposit insurance, could engage in speculation in derivatives, which can get you in a lot of trouble, with its own money. The banks can still be the executor of derivative transactions for other people, but they cannot put their own money at risk. And that was added over the objection of the big banks, and it has gone into effect. There were a couple other things that were added that were not necessarily related. One, I'm very proud of, and it was brought to me by Bono. He is a great activist and intelligent advocate for reform, and he has done a lot of work in Africa. And he brought to us an amendment that's called Publish What You Pay. It's not related to the financial crisis, but sometimes the train's leaving the station, you put a car on. And this says that if you are an American company, because that's what we have jurisdiction over, and you are extracting some mineral from another country, oil, steel, gold, whatever, iron, you don't extract steel, iron, you must publish publicly anything you pay to people in that country to give that same installation to the Securities Exchange Commission, to the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, and it lost in the Senate because the Appropriations Committee made it a turf issue. But by and large, it came out the way we wanted it to go in.
Well, thank you so much, Representative Frank. We really appreciate you being here, and it's been a fantastic conversation. Thank you all for coming. So please remember to do your civic duty, no matter what your political persuasions are, this November. And check us out on Facebook, the Denver Project for Humanistic Inquiry. Please come to some of our future events. We'd love to have you. Thanks again.